Now, we know you don't get behind the wheel of a car when you're drunk. It's also illegal in most countries to try to drive under the influence of drugs. But what about when you've not had enough sleep? Well, researchers in Australia are now working on a test to measure whether a driver who has caused a road accident was sleep deprived. Professor Dirk-Jan Dijk is from the Sleep Centre at the University of Surrey and has done experiments to find out how much sleep people have had. Professor Dijk, good morning to you. Morning.
Good morning to you.
And Dr. Lindsay Browning is a sleep expert, neuroscientist, psychologist and author who joins us as well. Lindsay, hello.
Good morning.
Dr. Browning, hello. Right, let's start with Dirk. Dirk, do I call you Dirk-Jan or just Dirk?
Well, Dirk-Jan is perfect.
Perfect, thank you very much. Dirk-Jan, how do you test how much sleep people have had?
Well, that's obviously the question we're trying to answer. What we do know that when you don't sleep or you don't sleep enough, there are changes in your body in several tissues, including the brain, but there are also changes in blood. Certain molecules increase their concentration, other molecules reduce their concentration as you have been awake longer and longer. And by measuring those molecules, and you need to measure several, you can establish whether somebody skipped a night of sleep, yes or no.
Okay, how accurate is it? I'm assuming this has been done in test conditions so far.
What we have done in test conditions, and we published this 4 years ago, we found that if we take a blood sample at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we can say with 90% accuracy whether that particular individual skipped the night and was awake rather than asleep. And this was done even though the algorithm, which was derived with the help of machine learning, had never seen a sample of that individual before.
Okay. And have you got to the point where you know what is a dangerous level and what is a healthy level?
The blood sample tells you basically how long you have been awake. How impaired you are is another question. But we know from numerous reports that when you sleep less than 4 hours, there definitely is a risk that you will fall asleep while doing certain things like driving.
So you can't, so it's the impairment issue, isn't it? Unless you have an arbitrary level like you do with alcohol, I suppose.
You're absolutely right. For alcohol, we say if you have this particular alcohol blood level, you are in reach of the law. We don't know how impaired people are at that particular blood alcohol level. Nevertheless, there is an arbitrary threshold, and this is an accepted threshold. There is no reason to not set a similar threshold for hours that you need to have slept before you can drive a car or operate any other machinery or fly a plane.
Obviously, this is going to raise so many questions. I'm obsessed with sleep, and most people, I think, are. Lindsay, Dr. Lindsay Browning, when you first hear about this test, what questions does it raise for you?
Well, I think in theory, it's a fantastic step forward, because you think 30 years ago, people would drive without really thinking about it. And yet now, no one would think that they should drink and then get behind the wheel, and they know it's wrong. And that's part of that is because we have a test to suggest when we are impaired because we have drunk too much. So the idea that there could be a biological indicator of whether we are overtired, whether we haven't had enough sleep, is a great step forward. Of course, there's another link between that the idea of it in theory being a test that we can do, and what are those thresholds? What does it actually mean? How are we going to implement it? Because that's a very different situation. So I think it's a great step forward, and I think it's going to provoke a lot of really important conversations that people shouldn't be driving sleepy, and maybe they haven't been thinking about that. But then it's another step to get to a place where we can actually put this in place and take a test on the roadside after a crash and say, right, well, this crash is your fault because you didn't have enough sleep the night before.
And let's just put this into context. I'm just reading because it first came up in The Guardian yesterday. In Scotland, which recently launched a national campaign to raise awareness of the issue, fatigue is a contributory factor in about 50 fatal and serious injuries each year. Worldwide, between 10% and 20% of all road crashes are estimated to be fatigue-related. Lindsay, my question is, I am someone who doesn't need a lot of sleep to function well. I know many people who need 8 or 9 hours sleep to function well. If a blood test says, right, I've only had 4 hours sleep and I feel absolutely fine and that's normal for me, what is my defence?
Exactly, and that's where we have to put these tests in real world situations, because it could be that if you are someone, because there are people perhaps like yourself who are short sleepers who genetically don't need as much sleep as the next person. And myself personally, I'm definitely someone who needs more sleep than that. If I only got 4 hours sleep, I would not be able to function adequately. So what we need to do is to find out whether this blood marker, the biological markers of sleep deprivation, whether they are different in someone who is used to and is absolutely able to function on 4 hours sleep. That is the minority of people, because most people can't function well on 4 hours sleep. So that's where we need to get the next step of research, so that we're not penalising people who on 4 hours sleep are actually perfectly able to drive.
Dirk-Jan, is that the next step?
Well, that is one next step, but I just want to come back to this notion that, I can function well even though I haven't slept that much. One of the things we know from driving and sleep-related driving accidents, that certainly in young people, and certainly when they are driving at night, this drive for sleep can come on very suddenly and can really not be resisted. So even though people may think, I'm fine, I function well, they may nevertheless still be at risk and also put other people at risk.
And completely agree with that. But the fact is, it's subjective, isn't it? I mean, I'm not someone who needs to sleep for 8 hours. I know that. Yeah, I know people who do need 8 hours.
And we would like to get objective tests and better understand these individual differences. But if we have an objective test, at least for how long you have slept, we know what the circumstances are under which you did decide to drive or not.
How, and because I suppose it's physical what's being shown, I mean, this almost answers my question, but I'll ask it anyway. What happens, say I go to bed at 10 o'clock in the evening, wake up at 7 o'clock the next day, so that's 9 hours sleep, but I haven't slept well. Can the test show that? Because is it quality of sleep or amount of time you are asleep? Does that make sense?
Yes, so far the test we have done is really related to how long have you been awake or how many hours of sleep did you get. Of course, there are situations and sleep disorders like sleep apnea where people do sleep, but they stop breathing and they have many very brief awakenings which they don't remember. And people living with sleep apnea can be extremely sleepy and indeed be at risk of falling asleep at the wheel. So that's a clear example where the quality of sleep is also important. And that's why if you have sleep apnea, you shouldn't be driving unless you are treated for your sleep apnea.
And Lindsay, the other thing, and I know I'm taking a personal interest in this, shift workers. People who get up at stupid o'clock, who have to drive because there's no public transport, for example. How will this affect them?
Absolutely. Well, shift workers is one of those situations where they are, especially after a night shift, on the way home between 2, especially 6 in the morning, they are at a hugely significant increased risk of having a road traffic accident because their circadian rhythm is suggesting that they should be asleep. So as well, there's all sorts of factors at play, the quality of sleep, the amount of sleep, and the time of day it is, because even there's an increased risk of car accidents after lunch in that sort of that siesta time period between 2 and 4. So for shift workers, whenever I work with people doing shifts, trying to get a ride share on the way home, trying to get public transport if at all possible is really definitely what we want to happen after a night shift. But if that can't happen, worst case scenario, I'd suggest having a short nap before you get in the car on the way home. A 10-20 minute nap in the car before you start driving is going to help.
Lindsay, Dr. Lindsay Browning, sleep expert, neuroscientist, psychologist and author, thank you for your time. Professor Dirk-Jan Dijk from the Sleep Centre at the University of Surrey, who's done experiments like this. It's been fascinating. It's opened up a can of worms, I think, but something that's really been worth discussing. Thank you very much for your time as well. More from me after 12.
The Voice of the UK.